The royal betrayal and the unexpected heir. Margaret, the reigning queen, had tolerated her son's marriage, believing it a passing phase. But as years passed without an heir, her patience thinned. She saw Sarah as a curse upon the royal bloodline and yearned for Daniel to find a more suitable wife. "Daniel is blind with love," Margaret seethed. "He refuses to see the damage he is doing to our lineage. He needs a wife who can bear him an heir. It is time I take matters into my own hands." That night she summoned Daniel. She spoke of duty, of the weight of his lineage, and the kingdom's need for an heir. But Daniel, though torn, refused to leave Sarah. When Daniel met her, he was polite but distant. Though Anaiah was beautiful, she was not Sarah. But Margaret whispered in his ear, reminding him of duty, of the need for an heir. That night, Daniel lay awake, conflicted between love and obligation. With sorrow in his heart, Daniel left, unsure if he was making the right decision. Tears streamed down her face as she placed her hand on her belly. She had to tell Daniel, but he was lost in the palace walls, under his mother's rule. Daniel, conflicted but still in love with Sarah, shook his head. "She did what she thought was best for me." But Margaret's words lingered in his heart. As she packed her belongings, tears welled in her eyes. She loved Daniel, but was he still hers? The news sent shockwaves through the kingdom. Sarah, hearing of this, felt her heart shatter. Had Daniel truly chosen another? Margaret's expression remained calm. "You will do what is right for the kingdom. Marrying Anaiah will secure our bloodline." But Daniel's heart rebelled. He thought of Sarah, of their love, and for the first time he saw his mother's manipulations for what they were. "Sarah," he breathed, stepping toward her. She placed a hand on her stomach, her voice trembling. "I have something to tell you." But Daniel, defying his mother's decree, rushed to Sarah. He held her close, the realization hitting him like a storm. He had nearly lost the love of his life. Margaret narrowed her eyes. "She has no place here." But Daniel stood firm. "She is carrying my child." The revelation sent gasps through the court. Margaret paled but quickly masked her shock with anger. Sarah, grateful for her honesty, reached for her hand. "Then help me end this." Margaret grew desperate, meeting with her most loyal advisers. "If the people turn against me, I will lose everything." She had to act fast. But Sarah, stronger than before, met her gaze. "I will not run this time." Margaret clenched her fists. If Sarah would not leave willingly, she would find another way. "We need to act before she forces Daniel into a marriage he doesn't want," Anaiah told Sarah. Sarah nodded, determination in her eyes. "Then we fight with truth." "You cannot silence the people," one of them cautioned. Margaret refused to listen. "Then I will ensure their voices are drowned out." Daniel looked his mother in the eye. "I would rather be exiled with the woman I love than be a king without a heart." Margaret was silent for a long moment before rising to her feet. "Then you are no son of mine." "She's gone!" a guard reported to the queen. Margaret's fury was boundless. "Find her! She will not escape me!" "Are you ready?" he asked. Sarah nodded. "As long as we're together." They rode off into the night, leaving behind the weight of royalty and Margaret's schemes. "We will start anew," Daniel promised, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Away from my mother's grasp." "They will not escape me," she vowed. "Not while I still draw breath." "I never thought I'd be this happy," she admitted one evening, resting against Daniel's shoulder. "The prince and his wife are in hiding," the spy whispered. "Shall we bring them back?" Margaret's lips curled into a cruel smile. "No, burn it to the ground." "We have to go, now!" Daniel shouted, taking Sarah's hand as they fled into the night. "She will not stop until they are dead," Anaiah murmured to herself. "I must do something." That night, she left the palace, determined to help the couple she had once been meant to replace. "The people are restless," one of her advisors warned. "You cannot keep ruling like this." But Margaret refused to listen. "I came to help," Anaya said. "Margaret has gone too far. The kingdom is turning against her, but we must act now, before she tightens her grip." Daniel exchanged a glance with Sarah. They had been running for too long. It was time to fight back. "This is no longer just about us," Daniel told Sarah. "This is about freeing the kingdom from my mother's tyranny." "Your time is over, Mother," Daniel declared, standing in the grand hall, sword in hand. Margaret, cornered and defeated, sank to her knees. "I did it for the kingdom," she whispered, but there was no kingdom left for her to rule. As Sarah held Daniel's hand at the coronation, she whispered, "We did it. Our child will be born into a kingdom of love, not fear." Anaya stood beside them, smiling. He will grow up in a world where he is free to choose his own destiny. The kingdom celebrated, knowing a new era had begun, one of peace, unity, and love. Daniel stood on the palace balcony, holding Sarah's hand as they looked upon their people. "This is what true leadership looks like," Sarah whispered. "A kingdom built on love, not fear." One day, Anaya visited her. "You have a chance to seek redemption," she said. "It is never too late to change." Margaret lowered her head. "Perhaps you are right." Daniel, despite everything, visited her. "I do not hate you, Mother," he said, "but I will not allow the past to define our future." Margaret turned away, silent. Could she ever be forgiven? "She can still do good," Sarah told Daniel. "She knows the burdens of the throne more than anyone." Daniel hesitated but eventually agreed. He offered Margaret a position as an advisor, should she choose to redeem herself. The palace was adorned for the grand celebration, and Sarah and Daniel stood proudly as Anaya and Elijah exchanged vows. It was another symbol of the kingdom's healing. Margaret, watching from a distance, felt something stir in her heart. She had once longed for an heir, but she had nearly destroyed everything in her pursuit of power. Now she saw what truly mattered. One evening, as Sarah and Daniel looked over the kingdom from the palace balcony, she whispered, "This is the future we fought for." Daniel called his council together. "We cannot allow our kingdom to fall into chaos again," he said. "We must protect what we have built." As Daniel and his council strategized, intelligence reports revealed the identity of the exiled noble, Lord Ravon, once a trusted advisor to Margaret before her fall. Ravon had fled into the mountains after Margaret's imprisonment, gathering remnants of her old loyalists and mercenaries to launch a rebellion. His aim was clear: seize the throne and undo the new era of peace. Sarah, though weary from the burdens of rule, refused to sit idly by. "We must act swiftly," she urged, her eyes reflecting the fire within. "If we allow him to build his strength, the kingdom will once again be thrown into war." Anaya nodded in agreement. "We need to infiltrate his ranks, understand his plans, and dismantle his forces before they strike." Elijah, now a revered general, took charge of assembling an elite unit of spies and warriors. As Daniel dispatched envoys to rally support from neighboring allies, the kingdom prepared for a confrontation that would determine the fate of their hard-earned peace. Anaya, determined to prove her loyalty and strength, volunteered to lead the mission to infiltrate Ravon's growing army. Dressed as a wandering noble seeking refuge from Daniel's rule, she ventured deep into the treacherous mountains with a handful of her most trusted spies. The enemy camp was a stronghold built within the crumbling ruins of an abandoned fortress. Inside, Ravon commanded his forces with cold precision. His bitterness toward Daniel fueled his thirst for vengeance. "The people do not yet realize how weak their king is," he told his followers. "We will show them what true strength looks like." As Anaya observed from the shadows, she uncovered a shocking revelation. Ravon had an informant within the palace walls. Someone close to the throne had been feeding him vital information. The betrayal ran deeper than they had imagined. Anaya knew she had to return to the palace with this information, but the enemy camp was heavily guarded. As she and her spies attempted to slip away, they were spotted by one of Ravon's sentries. A chase ensued through the treacherous terrain of the mountains, arrows whizzing past them. One of her spies, Leora, was struck, but urged them forward. "Go! The kingdom must know!" With a heavy heart, Anaya pressed on, knowing there was no time to grieve. She finally reached a hidden path leading back to the kingdom's borders, but the danger was far from over. Ravon's men were close behind. Meanwhile, within the palace walls, Daniel and Sarah continued to prepare for the impending battle, but the news of a traitor among them cast a shadow of doubt over the court. Anaya arrived breathless and wounded, revealing what she had discovered. "Someone within these walls has been feeding Ravon information," she gasped. "We have a spy in our midst." The court fell into stunned silence, eyes scanning the room in suspicion. Daniel clenched his fists. "We must root them out before it's too late." The palace was placed on high alert as Daniel and his advisors began an internal investigation. Every noble with access to sensitive information was scrutinized, their movements watched carefully. The betrayal was too deep, too dangerous to ignore. Margaret, still confined within the palace walls, but more subdued than before, observed the tension with a knowing gaze. "A traitor always slips," she murmured to herself, remembering her own past games of deception. Anaya, despite her injuries, worked alongside Elijah to uncover the mole. Through secret messages intercepted by spies, they traced the information leaks to Lord Cedric, a noble who had long resented Daniel's rule. When confronted, Cedric sneered. "You think your rule is untouchable? The people still fear change. They long for the old ways. Ravon is the true leader this kingdom deserves." Daniel's temper flared, but Sarah placed a calming hand on his arm. "Cedric, you've doomed yourself. Your loyalty is to a ghost of a kingdom that no longer exists." Cedric was swiftly imprisoned, his name stricken from all royal records. The palace had been cleansed of its greatest internal threat, but the battle was far from over. Ravon still gathered his forces, and now the final confrontation loomed. With the traitor exposed and his influence dismantled, Daniel turned his full attention to Ravon's growing army. Reports indicated that the rebel leader had amassed thousands of men, mercenaries from neighboring territories, and former soldiers loyal to the old regime. The kingdom stood at the precipice of war. Sarah and Anaya worked tirelessly to strengthen their own forces. Commoners, once reluctant to take up arms, were now emboldened by the truth. "We fight not just for the throne," Sarah declared to the gathered forces, "but for the freedom of our people. We will not allow tyranny to take root again." As Daniel led his army out of the capital, James, now old enough to understand the gravity of war, stood at the palace gates. "Promise me you'll come back," he pleaded, his eyes locked onto his father's. Daniel knelt before his son, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "I fight for you, James, for your future, and I will return." The march to war had begun. The day of battle arrived with the rising sun casting a golden glow over the rolling plains where Daniel's forces had assembled. Thousands of warriors stood in formation, their armor gleaming under the morning light. The air was thick with anticipation, the silence before the storm heavy upon them. Ravon's forces had taken control of the eastern valley, their banners raised high. The mercenaries he had recruited were hardened killers, men who thrived on chaos. Among them were deserters from the royal army, traitors who had abandoned their vows to follow the promise of gold and power. Daniel rode to the front lines, his presence a beacon of reassurance to his soldiers. Today we fight for our families, for our future. We will not let tyranny return to this kingdom. His voice carried across the field, met with roars of approval from his troops. Sarah and Anaiah, stationed among the strategists, watched with pride and determination. The horns of war sounded. The battlefield erupted into chaos as the two forces clashed, steel meeting steel, arrows darkening the sky. Elijah led a cavalry charge, cutting through Ravon's front lines. The battle was fierce, neither side willing to yield. In the heart of battle, Daniel sought out Ravon, knowing that victory depended on defeating him. The rebel leader stood atop a rocky outcrop, his dark armor glistening, his sword drawn. "You were never meant to rule, Daniel," Ravon sneered. "Your mercy makes you weak." Daniel climbed the rocks, his grip firm on his blade. "And your cruelty makes you blind. You think fear is power, but a kingdom ruled by terror crumbles faster than one built on trust." Their duel began, a fierce exchange of blows that sent sparks flying. Ravon fought like a man possessed, his strikes fueled by years of resentment. But Daniel, trained in both skill and strategy, countered with precise movements, forcing his opponent back. Around them, soldiers paused to witness the fate of the battle unfold in the clash of their kings. The fight raged on, both men growing weary, but Daniel found an opening. With one swift motion, he disarmed Ravon and pressed his sword to the rebel's throat. "This ends now. Surrender, and your men will live." Ravon, seething with rage, spat at his feet. "I would rather die than kneel before you." Daniel, unwilling to stain his hands with needless blood, gestured to his guards. "Then you will be imprisoned, and your legacy will fade into nothing." With Ravon defeated, his army lost their will to fight. Many surrendered, while others fled into the wilderness. The battlefield, once filled with war cries, fell into a heavy silence. Daniel stood among his warriors, blood and sweat dripping from his brow. "The battle is won," he declared, though the weight of war lingered in his heart. He turned to Sarah, who ran toward him, relief flooding her face. "You came back to me," she whispered, pressing her forehead against his. Elijah and Anaiah approached, victorious but weary. "The kingdom is safe," Elijah confirmed. "Ravon's threat is over." Daniel looked toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set. "Then we go home." Upon their return to the capital, the people erupted in celebration. Bells rang from the highest towers, and banners of victory adorned the streets. Citizens gathered to welcome their heroes home, cheering as Daniel and Sarah rode through the city gates, James and Isabella watching from the palace steps. Margaret, standing among the advisers, bowed her head slightly as Daniel dismounted. "You have done what I never could," she admitted quietly. "You fought for the people, not just for power." Sarah stepped forward, placing a hand on the older woman's shoulder. "The past is behind us. The future belongs to all of us." That night, a grand feast was held in the palace, marking the end of a dark chapter in the kingdom's history. As Daniel sat with his family, James turned to him with eager eyes. "One day, I want to lead as you do, Father." Daniel smiled, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Then you must learn not just how to rule, but how to serve. A true king listens before he commands." With the kingdom at peace, Daniel and Sarah turned their attention to preparing their children for the future. James, now on the verge of adolescence, had begun training with Elijah, learning the art of swordplay and strategy. Isabella, though younger, was already showing signs of intelligence and wisdom beyond her years. Margaret took it upon herself to mentor Isabella in courtly matters, ensuring she understood the weight of diplomacy. One evening, as Daniel watched James spar with Elijah, he turned to Sarah. "He's growing stronger every day," he mused, "but I want him to understand that ruling is not just about strength, it's about wisdom, compassion, and knowing when to act." Sarah smiled, lacing her fingers with his. "That is why he has you to guide him. And Isabella, she will be a force of her own. Together, they will ensure the future of this kingdom." As the kingdom settled into its newfound peace, troubling news arrived from the northern borders. A once dormant faction known as the Shadowborn, remnants of an ancient war, had resurfaced. They had begun raiding villages, striking fear into the people. Daniel knew he could not ignore the threat. Anaya, now a trusted advisor in the royal court, spoke gravely. "They do not seek war in the way Ravon did. They thrive in the shadows, attacking when least expected. If we are to stop them, we must outthink them." Elijah, ever prepared for battle, began assembling an elite force to track the Shadowborn's movements. But Sarah had another idea. "Let me go to them. If they fight from the shadows, we must understand what drives them. Perhaps this can be solved without more bloodshed." Daniel hesitated, but he knew Sarah's intuition had never failed them. "We do this together." Daniel, Sarah, and a small group of trusted warriors ventured into the northern forests, where the Shadowborn were said to dwell. The journey was treacherous, filled with hidden traps and watchful eyes. As they approached a clearing, they were surrounded by silent figures emerging from the darkness, their weapons drawn. A woman stepped forward, her gaze cold and calculating. "You bring war to our land?" she asked. "Or do you seek the truth?" Sarah stepped forward before Daniel could speak. "We seek peace, but we will not allow innocent lives to be harmed. Why have you returned?" The woman, who introduced herself as Lyra, leader of the Shadowborn, studied them before finally replying. "Because war never truly ends, it only waits." Lyra's piercing gaze bore into Sarah's as silence settled over the clearing. The Shadowborn warriors, clad in dark armor, held their weapons at the ready, though they had not yet struck. The tension was suffocating, but Sarah held firm. "We do not seek war," she repeated, her voice steady. "But we will not allow your attacks on innocent villages to continue. What is it you want?" Lyra studied her for a long moment before she spoke. "We want justice. For generations, our people have been outcasts, blamed for crimes we did not commit. The old kings hunted us, forcing us into exile, labeling us as threats. We survived in the shadows, but now we reclaim what was stolen." Daniel exchanged a glance with Sarah. He had studied the kingdom's history, and while he knew of the old conflicts, he had not realized how deeply the wounds had festered. "Then help us understand," he said, stepping forward. "What was taken from you?" Lyra hesitated before answering. "Our land, our right to exist within the kingdom's walls. We were once protectors, but fear turned us into outlaws. If you wish for peace, prove that you will not repeat the sins of the past." Sarah took a deep breath. "Then let's end this here. No more raids, no more bloodshed. Meet with us, speak your truth, and let us find a way forward together." The Shadowborn leader studied them for a long moment before nodding. "Very well, we will speak." Lyra led Daniel and Sarah deeper into the forest, where the Shadowborn had built a hidden sanctuary. It was nothing like the chaotic bandit camps Daniel had imagined. Instead, it was a thriving, self-sufficient settlement, its people hardened by years of exile yet strong in spirit. Children played near watchtowers, while warriors trained in quiet discipline. Lyra gestured toward the settlement. "Does this look like a band of criminals to you?" Sarah's heart clenched. These were not mere raiders. They were people who had been forced to fight for survival. "This is why you resist the kingdom," she murmured. "Because we were never given a choice," Lyra answered. "For generations, we have lived with the knowledge that we are one royal decree away from being slaughtered. Ravon promised us a future where we could reclaim our place, but his path was one of destruction. I do not seek a throne, but I will not let my people be forgotten." Daniel exhaled slowly. "What if I offered you a seat at the table, a chance to rejoin the kingdom, not as rebels, but as citizens?" Lyra narrowed her eyes. "You would allow us back?" Sarah nodded. "If you pledge peace, yes, you should not have to live in exile forever." For the first time, Lyra's hardened expression softened. "Then we may have a future worth fighting for." After much deliberation, Daniel and Sarah invited Lyra to the capital to formally discuss terms of peace. It was a risky move, but they knew trust had to begin somewhere. The Shadowborn leader hesitated, wary of a trap, but Sarah's sincerity seemed to convince her. As they rode back to the palace, Lyra marveled at the city's grandeur. It had been years since her people had walked freely in these streets, but while many citizens eyed the Shadowborn warily, others seemed curious, perhaps even hopeful. At the palace, a tense meeting was held in the grand hall. Nobles murmured in shock as Lyra took her seat among them. "This kingdom once cast us into the dark," she addressed them, her voice strong. "But we have endured. If your king and queen truly wish for peace, let them prove it, not with words, but with action." Daniel nodded. "Then we will grant the Shadowborn a place in our kingdom, lands to settle as their own, and a seat on our council. But in return, you must swear your allegiance to the crown." Lyra glanced at her warriors, then back at Daniel and Sarah. "Then let this be the first step." Not all were pleased with the pact. Many nobles saw the Shadowborn as enemies who could never be trusted. In the days following the announcement, tensions rose within the court. An influential noble, Lord Garrick, voiced his opposition. "You would let killers and thieves walk among us as equals?" he sneered. "This is a mistake." Margaret, who had once ruled with iron control, watched silently from the sidelines. But when Garrick's influence grew stronger, she finally spoke. "You forget your history," she said, stepping forward. "There was a time when even I thought power alone could keep this kingdom strong. But wisdom has taught me otherwise. A kingdom divided will fall. The Shadowborn are not our enemy. Fear is." Despite opposition, Daniel remained firm. "We will not turn away those who seek peace. If you cannot accept this, you stand against the future of this kingdom." With that, the council was split, some in favor, some against. The kingdom stood on the precipice of either unity or civil unrest. The tension in the palace reached a breaking point. Lord Garrick and his allies, unwilling to accept the presence of the Shadowborn, began rallying dissenters within the nobility. Whispers of rebellion spread through the court, and secret meetings were held in the shadows of the palace halls. Daniel and Sarah, though determined to maintain peace, knew that this unrest could tear apart everything they had built. James, observing his father's struggles, approached him one evening. "If they cannot see what you are doing is right, will they ever accept it?" he asked. Daniel sighed. "Change is difficult, son, but a ruler does not bend to fear. He stands for what is right, even when others resist." Meanwhile, Lyra and the Shadowborn continued to face hostility. Some villagers refused to trade with them, and minor skirmishes broke out in the streets. It became clear that if something was not done soon, the kingdom would erupt into civil war. Lord Garrick, emboldened by his growing support, confronted Daniel in the throne room. If you insist on this foolish alliance, you will lose the faith of your people. We will not stand by while you destroy this kingdom." Daniel's patience wore thin. "This kingdom belongs to all who swear loyalty to it. If you cannot accept that, then you are the true traitor here." Lord Garrick left with a warning. "You will regret this, Your Majesty." That night, the palace was cloaked in silence, save for the flickering torches lining the hallways. But in the shadows, danger lurked. A lone figure, dressed in dark garb, slipped through the corridors, moving toward the royal chambers with deadly intent. Inside, Sarah stirred in her sleep, a strange feeling of unease washing over her. She reached for Daniel, but the bed beside her was empty. Panic flared in her chest as she heard the soft creak of the door opening. The assassin lunged. Sarah barely had time to react before a blade slashed through the air, but Daniel, sensing the danger, had returned just in time. He blocked the attack with his sword, engaging in a deadly dance with the intruder. Steel met steel in a furious clash as Sarah grabbed a dagger from the nightstand, ready to defend herself. The commotion alerted the guards, who burst into the room just as Daniel disarmed the assassin, pinning him to the floor. With a harsh yank, Daniel pulled down the assassin's hood, revealing a familiar face, one of Lord Garrick's most trusted men. "So this is how you plan to fight back?" Daniel spat. "Cowardice in the dark?" The assassin sneered. "You may have stopped me tonight, but the fight is far from over." The failed assassination attempt sent shockwaves through the kingdom. The attack proved that Lord Garrick's defiance had turned into outright rebellion. Daniel, still seething with anger, knew he could no longer wait for diplomacy to take its course. Garrick had to be stopped before he could plunge the kingdom into civil war. Sarah called for an emergency council meeting. "We cannot afford hesitation. Garrick's forces are growing, and his supporters will not stop until they see the throne fall." Elijah, ever the strategist, leaned forward. "We must strike before he consolidates power. My scouts report that Garrick is rallying his men in the western province. If we move now, we can crush his rebellion before it gains traction." Lyra, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "We will fight with you." Her declaration turned heads, as many still did not fully trust the Shadowborn, but she continued, unwavering. "This kingdom gave us a chance at peace. We will not let traitors destroy it." Daniel nodded in agreement. "Then we march at dawn. Garrick will not get the chance to divide this kingdom." That night, the capital remained tense, the people uncertain of what was to come. But in the palace war room, the battle lines were drawn. The final confrontation was at hand. As the sun rose, Daniel's army, strengthened by the Shadowborn warriors and the kingdom's loyal soldiers, marched toward the western province where Garrick had stationed his forces. The battlefield stretched wide, with rolling hills and dense forests providing cover for both sides. From the ridge, Daniel could see the banners of Garrick's rebels fluttering in the wind. He turned to his commanders. "We hold the high ground. Elijah, take the cavalry and flank from the east. Lyra, lead your warriors through the forests. I will lead the main charge." Sarah, despite Daniel's protests, had donned armor and prepared to ride into battle. "This is our fight, Daniel. I will not stand back and watch while our kingdom is at war." The horns of war sounded, and the battle erupted in chaos. Arrows rained down, swords clashed, and the once peaceful land became a brutal war zone. Elijah's cavalry crashed into the rebel forces, scattering them, while Lyra's Shadowborn warriors struck from the trees, swift and merciless. In the heart of the battle, Daniel sought out Garrick. When their eyes met across the battlefield, Daniel knew this would end today. The chaos of battle surrounded them, but for Daniel and Garrick, only one thing remained: settling their feud in combat. The two warriors faced each other, blades drawn, the din of war fading into the background. Garrick sneered, circling Daniel. "You think you're a king because you were born one? You are weak, bending to the will of outcasts and peasants." Daniel's grip on his sword tightened. "A true king stands with his people, not above them. That is why you will never rule." Their swords met in a violent clash, each strike echoing the weight of their convictions. Garrick fought with brute strength, his attacks wild and relentless, but Daniel was precise, his movements refined by years of training and battle experience. Blow after blow, they fought, until at last, Daniel found his opening. With one swift motion, he knocked Garrick's sword from his hand and pressed his blade to the traitor's throat. "Yield," Daniel commanded. Garrick's defiance flickered, but he knew he had lost. He sank to his knees, breath ragged. "Do what you will. I will not beg." Daniel did not strike the final blow. Instead, he turned to his soldiers. "Take him to the capital. He will answer for his crimes before the people he betrayed." The battle was over. The kingdom had won. The aftermath of the battle saw Garrick and his remaining loyalists brought back to the capital in chains. The nobles who had conspired with him were forced to kneel before the throne, their fates decided by the very kingdom they sought to overthrow. Margaret, once a ruler who had clung to power with an iron grip, watched as justice was carried out. She turned to Sarah and Daniel. "You did what I could not. You led with wisdom instead of fear." Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder. "And you helped us get here. The past does not define the future." Lyra and the Shadowborn were granted citizenship, their people officially recognized as part of the kingdom. The common folk, having seen their valor in battle, began to welcome them as allies rather than enemies. It was a new dawn for the realm. At the palace, as celebrations began, James and Isabella watched from the balcony. "One day," James said, "this kingdom will be ours to protect." Isabella nodded. "And we will rule it together." Months later, as peace settled over the kingdom, Margaret, now frail with age, called Daniel and Sarah to her chambers. "My time is near," she admitted, "but I go knowing the kingdom is in strong hands." Sarah, holding her hand, nodded solemnly. "You have found peace at last?" Margaret smiled weakly. "Yes, and I am proud of you both." With those final words, the former queen passed, leaving behind a legacy of lessons learned. Her funeral was grand yet intimate, attended by nobles and commoners alike. Even Lyra and her people paid their respects. "She was once our enemy," Lyra said, "but she died knowing change had come." Years passed, and the kingdom flourished. James and Isabella grew into strong leaders, learning from their parents and shaping the future of the realm. Anaya and Elijah remained as protectors of the throne, their loyalty unwavering. On a quiet evening, Daniel and Sarah stood on the palace balcony, overlooking the kingdom they had fought to preserve. "We built something lasting," Sarah whispered. Daniel smiled. "And it will endure, long after we are gone." Below, the people thrived, their kingdom no longer divided but united in purpose and peace. And so, the royal betrayal became a distant memory, overshadowed by the legacy of love, unity, and strength that followed.